Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
Today we're going to be looking at air traffic control communications.
Yeah, the invisible network that keeps everything moving up there.
Right. We've got some really cool chapters from a pilot training manual all about instrument flight.
Yeah, lots of details in here about the equipment, the procedures, and even like the language they use.
It really is like a whole secret code up there.
It is. It's all about crystal clear communication.
So consider this your backstage pass to that world.
From takeoff to landing.
We're going to break it all down for you.
Demystify all.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
This manual mentions that civilian pilots use this specific frequency range to talk to ATC.
Right, so they use VHF, which is very high frequency, and that's between 118.0 and 136.975 megahertz.
So it's like their own little slice of the radio spectrum.
Exactly. And you know, it's interesting because it even mentions that they need their radios to have this 25 kilohertz spacing capability.
Yeah, what's that all about?
Yeah, that's to make sure that the signals don't overlap and cause interference.
Ah, okay. So no stepping on each other's radio toes up there.
Exactly.
Now, what about this whole simplex versus duplex thing?
Okay, so simplex communication is kind of like using a walkie-talkie.
Okay.
You can talk or you can listen, but you can't do both at the same time.
Okay.
Duplex is more like a phone call, where you're transmitting and receiving simultaneously on different frequencies.
So simplex is like taking turns, and duplex is like a real-time conversation.
Exactly.
Got it. But how does that actually work, like, in practice?
Well, it depends who the pilot is talking to.
Okay.
If they're talking to a flight service station or FSS, they might use simplex or duplex depending on the equipment and the situation.
Right, the FSS, those are the folks that provide weather briefings and file flight plans.
Yeah, they do a lot of different things.
They wear a lot of hats.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these basic frequencies down.
Yep.
We've kind of tackled simplex versus duplex.
Mm.
What about the actual equipment that pilots are using to make these calls?
Sure.
The manual mentions a transceiver.
Right. So that's basically a two-way radio that allows pilots to both transmit and receive messages.
Got it.
But it's not the only piece of equipment.
Right.
They've also got navigation receivers, which help them figure out where they are and follow their route.
Because obviously you need to know where you are when you're flying.
Of course.
Then there's this thing called an audio panel.
Yeah, so the audio panel is like the control center for all of the sounds in the cockpit.
Okay.
The pilot can manage incoming and outgoing transmissions. They can adjust the volume from different sources, like the transceiver, the navigation receivers, and they can choose which microphone they want to use.
It's like a sound mixer.
Yeah, like a high-tech sound mixer.
But why would a pilot need to switch between COM1 and CM2?
That's a good question, and it's about efficiency.
Okay.
Pilots can be listening to one frequency on CO1, say like the 8 ties, which gives them weather updates at the airport. But at the same time, they can be talking to air traffic control on COM2.
So it's like having two radio channels going at once.
Exactly.
Wow, talk about multitasking.
It is a lot.
This manual also mentions these newer GPS comm units that can automatically select frequencies based on your location.
Yeah, these are getting more and more common in modern aircraft. They take a lot of the mental workload off of the pilot.
Yeah, that's pretty futuristic.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about frequencies and the equipment pilots use to communicate.
Yeah.
What about the other side of the equation, the air traffic controllers?
Yeah.
How do they keep track of all those planes moving around up there?
So that's where radar comes in.
Okay.
And there are two main types.
Okay.
There's primary radar, which bounces signals off the plane itself, and then there's secondary radar, which uses a transponder.
Transponders sound like something out of Star Trek.
They are pretty cool pieces of technology.
Yeah, what do they do?
Basically, a transponder is a device on the airplane that receives signals from ground radar, and it sends back coded replies.
Ah.
This gives the controllers a lot more information about the aircraft, like its altitude and its identification.
So that's how they know who's who up there.
Exactly. And you've probably heard pilots talking about squawking a code.
Yeah, what's that all about?
So squawking is just pilot lingo for setting a specific code on their transponder.
Okay.
And when a controller asks a pilot to squawk ident, they're asking the pilot to press a button on the transponder that basically boosts their signal on the radar screen.
So it's like a way for the controller to say, hey, you did the Cessna, I need to see you more clearly.
Exactly. It helps them identify a specific aircraft.
Makes sense.
Especially when things are busy.
So radar and transponders, these are key players in this whole ATC system.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about the actual communication.
Sure.
It's not like pilots just pick up the mic and have a casual chat with the controller, right?
Right. Well, there is a very specific language and protocol used.
Okay.
Clarity is paramount. The manual mentions this thing called the Pilot Controller Glossary,
Okay.
which is part of the Aeronautical Information Manual, or A.
Oh, the AIM.
Yes.
That's like the Bible of aviation.
Yes, it's got all sorts of rules and regulations in it.
But this glossary, this is specifically focused on communication.
Yes. It defines all those standard terms and phrases used by pilots and controllers.
Okay.
It makes sure that everybody's on the same page.
So standardized terminology to avoid any confusion.
Exactly.
But then the manual also mentions a phonetic alphabet.
Yes.
What's that all about?
So that's about making sure that letters and numbers are understood clearly, even if they're static on the radio or different accents involved.
Okay.
So instead of saying A, you would say alpha. B becomes Bravo, and so on.
Makes total sense. Safety first.
Absolutely.
Thinking about all this standardized terminology in the phonetic alphabet, it seems like it would create a certain rhythm to these conversations.
You're absolutely right.
Like a dance almost.
It is like a well-rehearsed dance.
So pilots and controllers, they know what to expect from each other.
They do. And the manual actually encourages aspiring pilots to listen to live ATC communications to get a feel for the flow.
Huh. That's interesting.
It's really fascinating stuff.
But speaking of who they're talking to, it's not like there's just one giant control tower for the whole country, right?
Oh, no.
There's a whole network involved.
There is a whole network of facilities.
Like, who are all the players?
Well, we've got the flight service stations, or FSS.
Right.
We've got ATC towers, TRACONs, which stands for Terminal Radar Approach Control, and RTCCs, which are Air Route Traffic Control Centers.
Okay, whoa, that is a lot of acronyms to unpack.
It
It
is.
sounds like a pretty complex system.
It is very complex.
Can we break it down a little bit? Like, who does what? Starting with those mysterious flight strips?
Yes, those flight strips are essential.
I'm dying to know what those are all about.
They're like little cheat sheets for the controllers, giving them all the key details about a flight at a glance. You know, departure, airport, destination, airport planned route, altitude, all that stuff.
So it's like a condensed version of the flight plan all laid out on this strip of paper.
Exactly.
Wow, that's so old school.
I know, but it works, and they're constantly being updated as the flight progresses.
Okay, so like as the plane moves from one controller to the next, those strips get passed along.
Exactly. It's like a relay race.
But let's back up a bit and talk about those flight service stations, the FSS,
Sure.
because they're often the first point of contact for pilots.
Yeah, they're like the general practitioners of the aviation world.
Right. They do a whole range of things.
They provide weather briefings, they help pilots file their flight plans, they can even relay clearances from ATC.
And you can reach them in a few different ways.
Right by phone, by radio.
Oh, yeah. 1-800-WX-SPRAY-FIST.
That's the one.
So you call up FSS, you get your weather briefing, you file your flight plan.
Yep.
Then where does that flight plan actually go?
So once the briefer enters it into the system, it gets transmitted to the Air Route Traffic Control Center, or RTCC.
The RTCCC,
Okay.
which is responsible for the airspace you'll be flying in.
So these ARTCCs are like the regional managers of the sky.
It's a good way to put it.
So the RTCC receives the flight plan, and then...
That's when those flight strips come in.
Okay.
The RTCC's computer system takes all that flight plan information and it generates those strips, which get distributed to the different ATC facilities that are going to be handling your flight.
So the tower departure control the ARTCC sector you're going to be entering.
Yep, all the key players.
Wow, so it's like a carefully choreographed relay race,
It is.
with each facility getting the info they need to guide the flight safely.
Precisely.
But I remember the manual mentioned something about clearance void times
Yeah.
and release times when you're departing from an airport without a control tower.
Right?
That sounds kind of confusing.
So basically, when you depart from an airport without a tower, which is typically in Class G airspace,
You get your IFR clearance from the FSS,
Wow.
and that clearance will either have a clearance void time, which means you have to be airborne by a certain time,
right.
or a release time, which means you can't take off before a certain time.
So it's all about timing and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And pilots can actually make things run even more smoothly by letting the controller know when they expect to be airborne.
So just good communication all around.
Always.
So let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
And imagine we're departing from a larger airport with a control tower.
Sure.
Things are probably a bit more involved there, right?
Yeah, you'll be talking to a few different controllers.
Okay.
You've got clearance delivery, ground control, and the tower controller.
Okay. Starting to sound a bit more like what I see in movies with all those different voices.
Right.
But can we break down who does what?
Of course. So first up, you have clearance delivery.
Okay.
They're usually on a separate frequency, and you can find that listed in the Airport Facility Directory or AFD. And they'll issue you your IFR clearance, which includes your route, your altitude, your transponder code, and any special departure procedures you need to follow.
Right, and I remember the manual mentioned those departure procedures, or DPs.
Yeah, those are pre-planned routes that aircraft follow after takeoff
Okay.
to make sure they're safely separated from obstacles, terrain, other aircraft.
So like carefully choreographed exit ramps
Yeah.
from the airport.
Yeah, exactly.
And pilots are expected to review those procedures before they even talk to clearance delivery.
That's right.
So be prepared.
Absolutely.
Know what to expect.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get your clearance, you review your DP, then who do you talk to?
Next up is ground control.
Ground control.
They're the ones responsible for getting you from the parking area or the gate to the runway.
So they're like the traffic cops of the airport,
Exactly.
making sure everyone stays in their lane.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so once you're all lined up and ready to go.
Ground control will clear you to enter the runway and contact the tower.
Okay, so now we're ready for takeoff.
Almost.
We call up the tower controller
Yeah.
and just get cleared to go.
It's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
The tower controller actually coordinates with the departure radar controller, who's often located off-site, to make sure there's space for you in the flow of departing aircraft.
So even takeoff is a team effort.
It is.
Multiple controllers working together.
Lots of communication and coordination.
Okay. And once you're airborne and climbing,
The tower controller will usually hand you off to that departure controller.
who's part of the TRACON?
That's right.
TRACON, those terminal radar approach control folks.
Yep. They handle the busy airspace around the airport.
All right.
TRACONs are responsible for a certain area around major airports, usually extending out about 30 nautical miles.
Okay.
And they guide you through those initial stages of your climb, get you established on your route, and of course keep you separated from other traffic.
So TRACON handles that initial climb out, and then who takes over?
Well, once you're safely on your way, the TRACON controller will hand you off to the RTCC. Ah, right, the regional managers of the sky.
That's right.
They guide you through those longer stretches of your flight, the en route phase.
Exactly. RTCCs are responsible for huge chunks of airspace, often covering several states.
Wow.
And they have a whole team of controllers working different sectors, both geographically and by altitude.
Right, to keep all those planes safely separated.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how seamlessly they hand off control from one facility to the next.
It really is a well-oiled machine.
And to keep track of all those planes, they rely heavily on their own radar systems.
Yep, things like ARSR, Air Route Surveillance Radar.
So that's the center's eyes in the sky, helping them see all those little blips moving across their sector.
Precisely.
And just like the radar systems used by TRACONs, ARSR can display weather information.
Yep, which is incredibly helpful for both pilots and controllers.
Speaking of weather, this manual mentions something called minimum vectoring altitudes.
MVAs.
MVAs, right? What
Yeah.
are those all about? MVAs are basically the lowest altitudes that a controller can assign to an aircraft when they're providing what we call radar vectoring,
Okay.
which is just a fancy way of saying guiding the plane with specific headings and altitudes.
So it's like a safety buffer,
Exactly.
making sure planes stay clear of terrain even when they're under the direction of ATC.
Right. And pilots don't have to worry about calculating these MVAs themselves.
Okay.
Controllers have lots of tools and information at their disposal to determine what those safe altitudes are.
Got it. So the MVAs are built into the system, keeping pilots safe even when they're being vectored.
That's right.
But I'm curious, are there ever situations where a controller might assign an altitude that seems too low?
That's a great question, and the manual actually addresses that.
Okay.
It says that MVAs can sometimes be lower than the published procedural altitudes you might find on a chart.
Wait, so the MVA could be lower than what's on the chart?
Yes, because controllers have more information about the airspace and the terrain than what you might see depicted on a chart.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if they assign you an altitude that seems too low, don't be afraid to question it.
Okay, so it's always good to speak up if something doesn't feel right.
Absolutely.
But shifting gears again, this manual also mentions something called Tower en Route Control.
Tech.
Tech. What's that all about?
Tech is a pretty cool option for pilots who are flying shorter routes,
Okay.
generally below 10,000 feet.
Uh-huh.
It allows them to stay within terminal airspace under the control of the TRACON
Okay.
instead of being handed off to the center.
So it's like a shortcut through the ATC system.
Exactly.
Avoid that whole handoff to the RTCC.
Yeah.
Got it. So it can be a more efficient way to handle those shorter flights.
especially when traffic is light.
Okay, so we've covered FSS towers, TRACONs, RTCCs.
Yep.
Any other key players in this ATC network we should be aware of?
There's one more facility that plays a pretty important role, especially for pilots flying into airports that aren't located near a major metropolitan area, and that's approach control.
Approach control? But haven't we already talked about TRACONs, which also handle approaches?
Right, so this can be a little confusing.
Yeah, I'm getting lost in all the acronyms.
I know there are a lot of them.
Okay.
But here's the key difference. Approach control facilities are dedicated to providing those approach control services,
Okay.
even for airports that aren't within a TRACON's airspace.
Okay, so they're like specialized TRACONs.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Focused solely on getting planes safely onto the ground.
Exactly.
Even at smaller airports that might not have the same level of radar coverage or traffic density as a major hub.
They're kind of like the unsung heroes of the ATC world.
Right, quietly guiding those planes, and
Smooth landings even in more remote locations.
I like that, the unsung heroes.
They might not get as much attention, but their work is just as important
For sure.
in maintaining that overall safety and efficiency of the national airspace system.
Well said. And speaking of maintaining safety and efficiency, this manual mentions a technology called a Precision Runway Monitor. PRM, what's that all about?
PRM is a really interesting newer technology that's changing how we handle parallel runway operations.
Parallel runways, those are those runways that are right next to each other, right?
Exactly.
I've always wondered how they managed to land planes so close together.
It's pretty remarkable, and that's where PRM comes in.
Okay.
It uses a really sophisticated radar system and high-resolution displays that give the controllers incredibly precise information about the aircraft on those parallel approaches.
So it's like giving controllers superpowers.
It kind of is.
They can see exactly where each plane is, its speed, its projected path,
Yep.
even potential conflicts before they happen.
Exactly. All about maximizing safety while still allowing airports to handle more traffic.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is.
So we've talked about all these different facilities involved in an IFR flight, from that initial contact with FSS to the tower departure control, en route centers, approach control, and then finally the tower at our destination.
Yep, a whole team of players.
But I'm curious, how does a pilot actually know which facility to talk to at any given moment?
That's where these things called letters of agreement, or LOAs, come in.
LOAs, what are those? Some kind of secret agreement between the different facilities?
They're not exactly secret,
Okay.
but they're not something that pilots need to memorize or worry too much about.
Okay.
Basically, LOAs are agreements between different ATC facilities that define exactly where and at what altitude responsibility for an aircraft gets transferred.
So it's like predetermined handoff points.
Exactly.
So no confusion, no dropped calls, so to speak.
Right. It makes it much easier for everyone involved.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's one thing that's still bugging me. How do pilots know where these LOA points actually are?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, LOA information isn't publicly available.
Oh.
But here's a pro tip from the manual. Pay attention during your flights.
Pay attention. What do you mean?
Well, each time you're handed off to a new facility, the controller will usually mention the altitude and the location of that handoff. So you can start to piece together where those LOA points are based on your previous flights.
So it's like a puzzle. You start to see those patterns and you figure it out.
Exactly, and you can even mark them on your charts for future reference.
Okay, great advice.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from frequencies and equipment to all the different facilities that make up this ATC network.
We have.
But there's one more thing we need to talk about: weather.
Weather.
Because as we all know, weather can throw a real wrench into even the best laid flight plans.
You're telling me.
And knowing how to navigate those weather challenges, especially when you're flying IFR,
Right.
requires a whole other level of communication with ATC.
Right, because as we touched on before, ATC's radar can only see so much.
Yeah.
They can see those blobs of precipitation,
Uh-huh.
but they can't always tell us what's shading inside those clouds.
Exactly. So even with ATC's help, pilots need to be proactive.
Right.
And be prepared to make decisions based on what they're seeing on their own weather radar and what they're feeling in the cockpit.
Okay, so let's say we're cruising along, and up ahead, there's this massive thunderstorm blocking our path,
Okay.
like a wall of red and yellow on the radar.
Uh-huh.
What's the first step?
Well, while it's important to communicate clearly,
Okay.
remember that ATC is juggling a lot of different aircraft,
Right.
and they need specific information to help you safely.
Okay, so no need to panic,
Right.
but how do we phrase our request?
The manual outlines some good strategies.
Okay.
You can simply state, request deviation,
Okay.
and then specify the direction and distance.
Okay.
Like request deviation 10 miles, right, of course.
Got it.
Or if you need to climb or descend, you can say request higher or request lower,
Okay.
and then specify the altitude.
So clear and concise.
Exactly.
But what if a simple deviation isn't enough?
Right.
What if we need to completely reroute around a line of storms?
That's when you'd ask for a routing assistant.
Routing assistance.
You're basically saying, hey, I need help finding a new path through this mess. And you can even give them some suggestions like request routing via, and then name a specific waypoint or airway that you think would work.
Okay, so it's a bit of a collaborative effort.
It is.
Pilots and controllers working together
Yep.
to find the safest path.
Exactly.
But I remember the manual mentioning that weather data can sometimes be delayed.
Yes. That is something to keep in mind.
It seems a little unnerving,
It can be.
especially when we're talking about fast-moving thunderstorms.
So pilots need to stay vigilant and make decisions based on what they're observing in real time.
Okay, so what happens if we find ourselves in a situation where safety is paramount and we need to deviate immediately,
Right.
even without ATC clearance?
Well, that's where the concept of emergency authority comes in.
Okay.
If a pilot believes their safety is immediately threatened,
Right.
they have the authority to deviate from their clearance to avoid that hazard.
Wow. Okay, that's reassuring to know,
Absolutely.
but hopefully it never comes to that.
Hopefully not.
And pilots can do their part to avoid those last-minute scrambles by communicating their intentions early on,
Exactly.
especially if they see potential weather issues developing.
Right. Be proactive, plan ahead.
And don't wait till the last minute to call ATC for help.
But when you do make those requests for weather deviations, the manual highlights some key information you should be providing.
Okay, like what?
So first, state your proposed route,
Okay.
including where you'll deviate and where you'll rejoin your original course.
Okay.
Let them know what kind of flight conditions you're experiencing,
Okay.
things like turbulence icing.
Uh-huh.
And if you have weather radar on board, let them know if it's working properly.
So basically paint a clear picture for the controller, give them all the pieces of the puzzle so they can help you find the best solution.
Exactly.
But are there any limitations to what ATC can do?
Well, they do their best to accommodate pilots, but there are limitations.
Okay.
For example, it can be harder to accommodate weather detours in busy terminal areas near airports, where traffic is denser and procedures are more complex.
Like trying to reroute a parade through Times Square.
Yeah, exactly.
So even with the best intentions, sometimes it's just not possible.
And there can be limitations based on the equipment ATC is using.
Okay.
Some older radar systems, for example, can't display higher levels of precipitation intensity.
Okay. So it's not just about what the pilot sees on their radar, but also what the controller sees on theirs.
Precisely.
That makes sense.
And that's why pilot reports or pay-ups are so valuable.
Okay.
They help fill in those gaps.
So if you hit a patch of turbulence or encounter some icing, you let ATC know so they can pass that along to other aircraft,
It's a community effort.
keeping everyone safe.
Exactly.
And those PIA reps play a crucial role in helping controllers understand how those radar images translate to real-world conditions.
Right.
Because as we mentioned before, ATC radar can't see clouds. It can only see precipitation.
And that's where things can get a little tricky because we as pilots talk about avoiding clouds. But ATC is looking for areas of precipitation.
So how do they make sense of all those blobs of color on their radar screen?
They use a system of intensity levels to categorize the precipitation.
Okay.
And these levels are measured in dBz, which stands for decibels with respect to the radar reflectivity factor.
dBz, got it. So the higher the dBz,
The more intense the storm.
makes sense. But how do those dBz values translate into practical information for pilots?
So ATC facilities with weather processors typically use 4 levels of intensity: light, moderate, heavy, and extreme.
Okay.
And each level corresponds to a specific range of dBz values.
So when a controller says we're approaching an area of moderate precipitation,
Right.
they're giving us a heads up based on what their radar is showing.
Exactly. It's a way to communicate the potential for things like turbulence,
That.
reduced visibility.
But what about those ATC facilities that don't have those fancy weather processors?
They might not have the specific intensity levels, but they can still describe the location of those precipitation areas
Okay.
relative to the aircraft.
And they often use the phrase intensity unknown to indicate that they don't have that detailed information.
Okay, so even with limited technology, they're still trying to give us some guidance.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, you've got the RTCCs, those large regional facilities, which often have a sophisticated weather system called WARP.
Yes, the weather and radar processor.
Warp speed ahead.
So WARP is pretty cool.
Okay.
It combines data from multiple NextRed sites.
NextRad. Those are the ground-based weather radars, right?
Exactly. They provide very detailed weather information.
Okay.
So WARP takes all that data and creates a much broader and more comprehensive view of precipitation patterns.
So it's like a mosaic of weather data.
Exactly.
But even WARP has its limitations.
It does.
Okay.
The precipitation data can still be delayed.
Uh-huh.
And if WARP is down, they have to rely on a backup system which doesn't provide as much detail.
So even with all this advanced technology, it's still a human-driven system,
It is.
with controllers making decisions based on multiple sources of information.
Exactly.
It's really a testament to their skill and expertise at keeping everything running smoothly,
Absolutely.
even when Mother Nature throws a curveball.
Always.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive back into this whole weather thing.
Yeah, weather's a big one.
It really can make or break a flight.
It's that wild card.
And, as we touched on before, ATC's radar can only see so much.
Right.
They can see those precipitation areas, but they don't always know what's lurking inside.
Exactly.
So even with their help, pilots need to be prepared to make decisions based on what they're seeing on their own radar and what they're feeling.
Right. It's all about situational awareness.
So let's say we're cruising along and up ahead we see this massive thunderstorm blocking our path.
Okay.
It's like a wall of red and yellow on the radar. What do we do?
Well, it's important to communicate your concerns clearly.
Right,
But remember, ATC is juggling a lot of different aircraft,
of course.
and they need specific information to help you.
Okay, so no need to panic. Just stay calm and communicate. Exactly.
But how do we phrase our request for help?
The manual outlines a few different strategies. You
Okay.
can simply say, request deviation,
Okay.
and then specify the direction and the distance you want to move. Like, request deviation 10 miles, right? Of course.
Got it. Or if we need to climb or descend,
You can say request higher or request lower.
and specify the altitude we'd like to reach.
Exactly.
So it's all about being clear and concise.
Yep.
But what if a simple deviation isn't enough?
Right.
What if we need to completely reroute around a whole line of storms?
That's when you'd ask for routing assistance.
Okay, routing assistance.
You're basically telling ATC, hey, I need some help finding a new path through this.
Right.
And you can even give them suggestions like request routing via, and then name a specific waypoint or airway you think might work.
So it's a bit of a collaborative effort.
It is.
Pilots and controllers working together to find that safest path.
Precisely.
But I remember the manual mentioned that weather data can be delayed,
Yeah. That's definitely something to keep in mind.
especially with these fast-moving thunderstorms.
That's why it's so important for pilots to stay vigilant and make decisions based on what they're seeing in real time.
So what happens if we find ourselves in a situation where safety is really at stake and we need to deviate immediately,
Right.
even without that ATC clearance?
That's where this idea of emergency authority comes in.
Okay, emergency authority.
If a pilot believes their safety is immediately threatened,
Uh-huh.
they have the authority to deviate from their clearance to avoid that hazard.
Wow. Okay, that's good to know.
It is.
But hopefully it never comes to that.
Hopefully not.
Pilots can do their part to avoid those last-minute situations
Absolutely.
by communicating their intentions early on.
Right. Be proactive. Think ahead.
And when we do make those requests for weather deviations,
Mhm.
what kind of information should we be giving to ATC?
So the more info you can give them, the better they can help you.
Okay.
The manual highlights a few key things.
All right.
First, state your proposed route, including the points where you'll deviate and then rejoin your original course.
Got it.
Let them know what kind of flight conditions you're experiencing.
Okay, so turbulence, icing, things like that.
Exactly.
And if you have weather radar on board, let them know if it's working properly.
Right. Give them the full picture.
So paint a clear picture for them, give them all the pieces so they can put the puzzle together.
Yep. Make it easier for them to help you.
But are there limitations to what ATC can do? Can they always grant those requests for deviations?
They do their best to accommodate pilots, but there are limitations.
Okay, like what?
For example, accommodating weather detours can be more challenging in busy terminal areas.
Right near airports where it's already crowded.
Exactly.
And there can also be limitations based on the equipment ATC is using.
Right. Some older radar systems can't display those higher levels of precipitation intensity.
So it's not just about what the pilot sees on their radar, it's also about what the controller sees on theirs.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
That's why those pilot reports or PIREPs are so important.
Right? They help fill in those gaps.
Exactly.
So if you hit some turbulence or encounter icing, let ATC know
Right.
so they can pass that info along.
It's all about working together.
A real community effort up there.
Absolutely.
And speaking of those PRFs, they really help controllers understand how those radar images translate into real-world conditions.
Right, because ATC radar can't see clouds. It can only see precipitation.
Right. And that can get tricky because as pilots, we might be thinking about avoiding clouds,
Uh-huh.
but ATC is looking for areas of precipitation.
So how do they make sense of all those blobs of color on their radar screen?
Right.
Well, they use a system of intensity levels to categorize the precipitation.
Yeah.
And these levels are measured in dBz,
DBZ.
which stands for decibels with respect to the radar reflectivity factor.
DBZ, got it. So the higher the DBZ, the more intense the storm.
Exactly.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So ATC facilities with weather processors typically use 4 levels of intensity:
Okay.
light, moderate, heavy, and extreme.
And each level corresponds to a specific range of dBz values.
So when a controller says you're approaching an area of moderate precipitation,
Uh-huh.
they're giving us a heads up.
Exactly. It's a way for them to communicate the potential for turbulence-reduced visibility.
Got it. But what about those facilities that don't have those fancy weather processors?
Well, they might not have those specific intensity levels, but they can still describe the location of the precipitation
Right.
relative to the aircraft.
Right.
And they often use the phrase intensity unknown to indicate that they don't have that detailed information.
So even with limited technology, they're still giving us the best guidance they can.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you've got those RTCCs, the big regional centers.
Right.
They often have a more sophisticated weather system called WARP.
Yes, the weather and radar processor.
Okay.
WARP combines data from multiple NEXRAD sites.
Right, those ground-based weather radars.
Exactly.
And it creates a much broader, more comprehensive view of those precipitation patterns.
Exactly like a mosaic of weather data.
But even WARP has its limitations.
It does.
The precipitation data can still be delayed.
Uh-huh.
And if WARP is down, they have to rely on a backup system that doesn't give them as much detail.
That's right.
So even with all this advanced technology, it's still a human-driven system.
It is.
Controllers are making these critical decisions
Yep,
based on multiple sources of information.
that's right.
It's really a testament to their skill and expertise,
It is.
keeping our skies safe and organized,
Absolutely a vital role.
even when Mother Nature throws those curveballs.
Always.
Well, this has been a fascinating look behind the scenes of air traffic control communications.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
from basic frequencies and equipment to the intricacies of weather avoidance.
Lots to learn.
It's amazing how much goes into keeping those planes moving safely and efficiently.
It really is a complex system.
A real testament to human ingenuity and collaboration.
I agree.
So if you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the Aeronautical Information Manual.
The AMM?
Yes. And you can even listen to live ATC communications online.
That's a great way to get a feel for the rhythm and flow.
And of course, keep those questions coming. We're always happy to delve deeper into these topics.
Absolutely.
So the next time you're on a flight, take a moment to appreciate those unseen voices guiding you through the skies.
Yeah, it really is an amazing system.
Safe travels, everyone. And until next time, keep exploring.
Keep looking up.